At Redwater Valley, dawn crept up slow, as if the sun itself hesitated to climb the parched hills. Rose Carver stood on the porch, the Winchester heavy in her hands, her gaze fixed on the half-open barn door. A dark trail of blood snaked inside, the scent of hay drowned by the tang of iron and human sweat. In the shadowed corner, a hulking man looked up, shirt torn to rags, shoulder slick with blood, eyes deep as a winter lake. This was no predator, but a beast cornered by fate. They said no one could love a man too big, too silent to belong anywhere. Yet she didn't flinch. She met his stare and spoke two words that tilted the world around them. Try me. Sometimes the one everyone fears carries a story strong enough to reshape your entire life. Dawn in Redwater Valley usually came slow, as if the sun itself were reluctant to climb over the parched ridges stretching all the way to the horizon. Outside, the early wind still carried the damp breath of night, slipping through the cracks in the boards, bringing with it the scattered crow of a rooster and the faint jingle of chains from the eastern stable. Rose was used to those sounds. They were the heartbeat of this ranch, so familiar she hardly noticed them anymore. But this morning, in the middle of that steady rhythm, another sound slipped in. Strange, out of place. First came the groan of wood, long and heavy, as if something were pressing against the wall. Then a breath, deep, weighted, and bone-tired. She lifted her head and listened again. Not a horse's snort. Not the wind knocking a door. This carried the trace of a human presence. The instinct of someone who'd lived alone on this kind of land made her heart drop for a beat, then pick up pace. She didn't rush. Nothing good ever came from charging outside with bare hands. Setting the coffee pot aside, she reached for the Winchester on the rack by the door, pulled open the small drawer beneath the table for a box of cartridges. Her hands moved with practiced ease, her wrist steady, even as her ears strained for any shift in sound. The dry click of a round chambering echoed in the still kitchen. One hand wrapped around the stock, the other gripped the oil lamp. The yellow flame swayed with her steps as Rose opened the door, the rush of cold air narrowing her eyes. The yard was still wet with dew, each droplet clinging to the wild grass along the fence line. The wind swept under the porch roof, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint bite of trampled weeds. Rose moved slow, each step solid on the cool ground, her boots tapping a measured rhythm that didn't give too much away. She angled the lamp to light the space in front of the stable. The door stood ajar, the hinge giving a soft, tired creak in the wind. Inside, a faint glimmer caught on something wet near the threshold. She crouched. The dark smear was blood, still fresh, stretching into the shadows. Her grip on the Winchester tightened, her finger brushing the trigger guard. Inside, the familiar scent of dry hay had been crowded out by the tang of blood and the stale weight of sweat. The lamplight swept over shadowed corners until it stopped on a large shape slumped against the wall. He wasn't wearing a coat, and the coarse cotton shirt on his broad frame was torn ragged at the left shoulder, the fabric there dark and wet. That massive frame seemed to swallow half the stall. He lifted his head when the light reached him. His eyes were dark, deep, and still as a winter lake. But something in them rose from lowering the rifle. Not the look of a predator, but of an animal driven into its last corner. His voice was rough, low, dragging each word as if it weighed more than the air. They said no one could ever love a man like me. Too big, too quiet, too different. Rose straightened. keeping the rifle steady but never breaking eye contact. She knew the tricks of those who preyed on pity, but these words didn't sound like a plea. They sounded like an old verdict, repeated so often it had become the truth in the speaker's mind. A long silence settled in, broken only by the shifting of a horse in the far stall and the wind hissing through the gaps in the boards. Then Rose answered, her voice even, neither high nor low. "Try me." Two words dropped into the space between them, light but certain as an anchor. He didn't smile, didn't look surprised, only blinked slow, as if weighing whether that reply was real or just another trap. Rose kept the rifle where it was, but she could feel the tension in her hands easing. A gust of wind pushed through the door, tipping the lamp's flame and stretching his shadow across the straw. Rose's eyes swept the stable. No other movement, no strange horses, no sound from outside. Only him, big and worn down, as if he'd walked too far with no one waiting. In that moment, she felt something she couldn't name. Not fear, not quite pity. Maybe curiosity or the recognition of something familiar in a man she'd never seen before. The way he sat still, waiting, but never ran. She lowered the lamp just enough so the light no longer shone straight into his face. "You're hurt." He gave a single, small nod. Not from a horse. Another nod. She didn't ask more. Out here, silence was often the only safe language, on both sides. Outside, the sky was beginning to pale, casting a cold gold over the stable roof. Rose knew she'd have to choose fast. Send him off now, or get him inside before someone else saw him. The second choice was riskier, but looking at the torn shirt and the spreading blood, she doubted he'd get far if she forced him out. She drew a deep breath, stepped back just enough to keep her aim useful if needed. "Can you stand?" He shifted, bracing a hand on the floorboards, his face tightening with pain. He didn't answer, just tried again, and this time got to his feet, though leaning slightly to one side. His height made her tilt her chin up, but she didn't give ground. "Come with me," she said, more command than request. Rose led him toward the storage shed where she kept tools and a few basic supplies. Each step she measured the space between them, close enough to help if he faltered, far enough to react if he made a wrong move. She pushed open the shed door. The scent of old wood and dust mingled with the sharp hint of mint from the bundle hanging from the beam. Setting the lamp on the table, she turned to him. "I don't know who you are, but if you're staying here, you'll at least let me see that wound." He stayed silent for a long moment, before giving a short nod. The gesture didn't feel like surrender. It felt like he was handing over a small piece of trust. And out here, that was rare and worth something. The oil lamp Rose had set on the shed's wooden table swayed faintly, its yellow light sweeping across corners thick with dust. Her gaze dropped to the floor just beside the man's boots. There, a coarse gray sack lay crumpled, its rope tie half loosened. The opening had gaped just enough to reveal the edge of something dark and wooden inside. Rose's instincts pulled her mind toward the likely things. Pistol, knife, maybe a bag of silver. Those made sense for a wounded stranger to be carrying. But what glinted from inside the sack slowed her for a beat. She bent down, nudging the sack open with the barrel of her Winchester. No flash of steel, no smell of powder. Instead, a weather-worn guitar rested inside, its finish rubbed thin, a few strings loose. The wood bore fine scratches, as if from fingernails, and small dents that only years could make. Beside it lay a small bundle of black and white photographs, their edges frayed, paper gone yellow. Rose lingered longer than she meant to. Out here, folks rarely carried anything fragile, let alone a musical instrument and a few photographs. They couldn't feed you if you were ambushed, couldn't stop a bullet. Elias Boone, though she didn't yet know his name, leaned down slightly. His broad, calloused hand touched the guitar's surface, fingers sliding along the neck, as if to reassure himself it was still there, still whole. In his eyes, she caught two things that didn't belong together: a far-off gaze fixed on some place hundreds of miles away, and a guardedness, as if bracing for someone to tear it from him. Rose didn't lower her rifle, but her finger had eased away from the trigger without her noticing. The sight before her, a man big enough to block a doorway, bleeding, yet holding a guitar like the last thing worth saving, carried a weight she couldn't name. It softened instincts that years alone had sharpened. Her glance flicked to the photographs. One showed a young woman on a porch, hair tied back, her face caught between a smile and something sterner. Another showed a small boy perched in a saddle, legs too short to reach the stirrups. One photo had a blurred corner, as if it had once been wet, the paper curling in a permanent wave. She stepped back, lifting her gaze from the guitar to his face. "Not what I expected to find," she said, her voice lacking the edge it had before. He didn't answer right away, just gave a small nod, as though she'd stated the obvious. His hand stayed on the guitar, the knuckles whitening. In that moment, Rose understood this wasn't just an object. It was the last piece of a story she hadn't heard. She gestured toward the long bench against the wall. "Sit there." He hesitated, then obeyed, setting the sack at his feet, with the guitar still within reach. Rose kept the space between them, close enough to read his movements, far enough for the Winchester to matter if it had to. "Anywhere else you're hurt?" she asked. Her assaute, eyes straying to the dark stain at his shoulder. Shoulder, and a little at the ribs, his voice low and rough, like gravel in a stream. Rose set the rifle within easy reach on the table, then fetched a tin basin, dipping water from the wooden barrel near the door. The steady splash was joined by the shuffle of a horse outside. She placed the basin down, laid a clean rag beside it, but didn't start on the wound yet. Instead, she looked straight at him, a look that wasn't quite distrust, but not trust either. "You carry a guitar, not a gun. Why?" He lifted his eyes to meet hers. Maybe it was the lamplight, but they seemed veiled, and when his reply came, it lagged half a beat behind. "Because a gun, anyone can buy another. But this," his finger brushed the guitar's body, "there's only one." Rose didn't answer. She let the space between question and answer stand, a quiet pause like a comma in a long sentence. She stepped aside, nodding toward the small door that led deeper into the shed. "Come on, too cold and dusty in here." He gave a slight nod, took up the sack, and followed her. As they crossed the threshold, the lamplight threw their shadows against the boards, one tall, one smaller, moving side by side but not too close. And in Rose's mind, the question from before still lingered. A man on the run carrying a guitar. Just who was he? Rose set his sack aside, near the longest bench, so it would stay in Elias's line of sight, then reached up to the high shelf for a bottle of strong liquor. Not the kind poured at supper, but the harsh, biting sort her grandmother used to say could cure both wounds and a man's stubborn streak. From the same shelf, she took down a spool of black thread, a large sewing needle, and several strips of clean cloth wrapped in a linen square. Elias sat on the bench against the wall, his shadow covering half the boards behind him. The oil lamp on the table carved his features in sharp relief, jaw set hard, cheekbones cut sharp, skin weathered to the color of old timber and marked with fine cracks. But it was his eyes that held her attention. They didn't exactly avoid hers, yet every so often they flicked toward the small window opposite, as though measuring the distance from here to outside, or waiting for something to appear. "Shirt off," Rose said, her tone flat, carrying the weight of a well-worn order. Elias unfastened the buttons one by one, slow, but not clumsy. When the thick fabric slid from his shoulders, the wound was plain. A long tear across the left shoulder blade, the edges swollen and red. The blood dried into a dark stain at the fringe. From the cut's depth and the way the flesh had torn, Rose knew it wasn't made by knife or bullet. It was narrow, curved, more like a claw mark than steel. She soaked a rag in the liquor, wrung it out, then pressed it to the wound. Elias drew a slow breath, but didn't pull back. "It'll burn," she warned, pressing firmer to work the dried blood loose. The sharp scent of alcohol rose, mixing with sweat and wood smoke, thickening the air. "Not everyone can sit that still," Rose said as she worked. "Not my first time," he answered, voice still gravel rough but steady, without a tremor. She began to stitch. Each pull of thread through skin landed in her ears like a heartbeat, his and hers alike. Elias stayed still, the muscle in his shoulder tight, never once flinching away. Only at the third stitch did he lean forward slightly, and in the narrow space between them, Rose felt the weight of him. She tied off the last knot, cut the thread, and wrapped his shoulder with a strip of clean cloth, knotting it firm but not cruel. "Done," she said, not as pride or relief, just a fact. Elias nodded, rolling his shoulder slightly to test it. He didn't hiss, but the dry swallow in his throat told her every muscle was answering back. "Thank you," he said, eyes flicking once more to the window. Rose tilted her head, narrowing her eyes. "What is it you keep looking for out there?" A short pause. "Just habit," he said, but she didn't buy it whole. She took the chair opposite, folding her hands together. "If someone's after you, I need to know. This ranch isn't a fortress." His gaze lingered on her a heartbeat longer before drifting to the sack in the corner. "Not something you'd want to be part of." "Maybe," Rose said, "but they'll come here if you stay." For the first time since they met, Elias turned and looked her full in the eyes. It wasn't a challenge. It was a test, to see if she'd blink or look away first. Rose didn't move, letting the silence stretch long enough that her answer didn't need words. She rose, putting the liquor and the spare cloth back on the shelf. "This'll take a few days to heal. If you mean to leave, you should do it while you still can." He didn't answer. When she turned back, he was still seated, hand resting on the bandage, eyes distant, as if working out some calculation in his head. She gave him one short line, enough to keep the fragile thread between them from snapping. "For now, you need rest. I'll make coffee." Elias nodded once, slow. As Rose stepped out, she heard the soft creak of the bench, just a shift in his weight as he leaned back against the wall. That was all. But it was enough for her to know he wasn't leaving just yet, and strangely, that knowledge brought her both unease and a quiet kind of relief. The water in the basin had turned murky, clouded with a mix of dirt and the stale scent of sweat. Rose wrung out Elias's dark coat, feeling the weight of it, heavier than any other cloth she'd washed, as if every thread had soaked up not just sweat, but the long, wandering miles he'd carried it through. When her hand turned out one of the coat's pockets, something small and solid pressed up under the torn lining. She pulled it free, a dull piece of silvered metal, its edges nicked, the lettering nearly worn away. But even with the years on it, the six-pointed star was still there, and beneath it, in faint, nearly unreadable letters, Deputy Sheriff. She stood still for a long moment, holding the badge in her wet fingers, letting the chill of the metal seep into her skin. Questions came fast. Why would a man on the run carry this? Had he once been the law, or just found it somewhere? And if he truly had worn the title of Deputy Sheriff, what had brought him to this? Sitting in her shed, wound still fresh, eyes flicking to the window as if danger might walk right in. Rose didn't ask, not yet. She slipped the badge into her skirt pocket and went back to the washing. Outside, the afternoon wind whistled through the wallboards, carrying the smell of scorched grass from the hills. Weather out here was always like that. Hot, dry, and ready to turn to storm without a moment's warning. That evening, when she stepped into the shed with a bowl of hot stew, Elias was propped against the wall, his wooden guitar resting beside him, untouched. His eyes opened at the sound of the door, gray and edged with a watchfulness that still carried fatigue. Rose set the bowl on an upturned barrel, her voice low but not cold. If they come here. Elias glanced at her just for a moment, the corner of his mouth tugged upward, half a smirk, half a test to see what she'd do. Then I'll go, he said slowly, as if weighing each word. After a pause, he added, or stay, if you want. Rose didn't answer right away. She only sat, watching the steam curl from the stew between them. In that moment, the air thickened, not with threat or suspicion, but with something else neither had named yet. She pushed the bowl toward him, though her gaze caught on the far corner of the shed, where the guitar leaned. It wasn't something you ran with, or defended yourself with. It belonged to a man who had once had a home, a table, and laughter. A man different from the one sitting before her, carrying a wound and an old badge. Elias took the stew, but didn't eat. His eyes followed her instead, as if reading every small shift in her face. Maybe he knew she'd found the badge. Maybe he was waiting for the question. But Rose didn't give him that chance. She stepped outside, leaving the scent of meat and broth mingling with the damp wood of the shed. Night fell slow. The light from the house spilled in a narrow gold stripe through the crack in the shed. Door. Rose sat at the kitchen table, the badge resting between her hands. Her fingers traced each scar on its surface, wondering about the roads it had traveled. Out here, a badge could mean justice, or it could be an excuse for power. From the shed came the low sound of a guitar, slow, rough, like strings that hadn't been tuned in a long time. Rose stilled her hands to listen. It wasn't a happy tune, nor was it truly sad. It sounded like a story told in notes, about long roads, red dust, and the things you're forced to leave behind. She didn't realize she'd risen until she was walking toward the shed, lamp in hand. When she opened the door, Elias didn't look up. He kept playing, fingers moving over the frets with the kind of surety that told her the guitar wasn't just an object. It was part of him, like breath. Rose leaned against the doorframe, letting the lamplight fall across his face. A thin scar traced his left jaw, visible only when his head was bent. She wondered how many times he'd sat like this, in some unfamiliar place, holding on to music just to keep himself whole. When the song ended, Elias set the guitar aside. He looked up, and this time his smile wasn't a smirk. "Was there something you wanted to ask?" Rose lifted the badge and set it lightly on the table between them. "I don't need to know everything," she said. "Just enough to know what I'll be facing if your past comes looking." Elias stared at the badge for a long time, his eyes seeming to drift farther than the walls around them. At last he spoke, voice low, like wind moving through a canyon. "The past never dies, Rose. It just lies still until someone decides to stir it." She gave a small nod, then turned to leave, the badge still on the table. Behind her, the guitar began again, this time deeper, carrying something that might have been a promise. And out here, sometimes the thinnest of reasons was enough to keep someone in place, or to make them vanish for good. On the third morning since Elias had stayed, the early mist still clung in thin strands between the last dry rows of corn. Rose went to the well for water as she always did. The rooster's call carried from the direction of the barn, mingling with the damp scent of earth and the sharp, dry smell of hay. She was just lowering the bucket when the sound of hoofbeats, urgent, distant but distinct, drew her attention toward the western field. 3 riders appeared at the far edge, where the low fence marked her land, from the strip of waste ground leading toward town. They didn't cross the fence. They just stopped. Their horses blew pale breath into the cold morning air. No greeting, no overt threat, but their eyes made the air feel heavy all the same. Rose straightened, one hand still on the rope, rainwater beating along the rim of the bucket and dripping onto her shirt. The wind carried the small shifts of saddle leather and the faint clink of metal, sidearms at their hips. They watched for a long time, without blinking. Then the lead rider tugged his reins, and all 3 turned away, leaving at a measured pace, as if they'd only been inspecting a forgotten patch of land. From the kitchen window, Elias had been standing there, watching, long before they left. He followed their retreat until the shapes of horse and rider slipped behind the ridge, then stepped out onto the porch. "Luther Kane," Elias said, voice low, not surprised. "He's just sending a message, not ready to make noise yet." Rose quietly turned back to the well, set the bucket down, and began to draw water as if she hadn't heard him, but her hand trembled slightly, and the water sloshed over the rim. "You know him?" Elias asked, walking toward her, eyes still fixed on the place where the riders had disappeared. She was silent for a few beats, then said only, "That man, his cigarette smoke lingers in town longer than winter wind." Elias didn't answer, only stepped off the porch, taking the bucket from her hands. "Let me." His draw was clean, without spilling a drop. The efficiency of his movements, and the way his gaze never wandered, but never scattered, left Rose feeling both steadied and unsettled, as if he were quietly rearranging a part of her life she'd grown used to leaving in disarray. Inside, Elias set the water down on the table and took the chair by the window, the one with a clear view of the dirt road into the ranch. Rose put wood in the stove, the scent of burning pine filling the room with a dry, steady warmth. "What does Luther want here?" Rose asked. Not quite curious, more like someone confirming what they already knew. "Land," Elias said, as if that one word covered the whole of it. Then after a beat, "And anyone standing in his way." Rose gave a short, humorless smile without looking at him. So he'll be back. Maybe. Elias leaned back, one hand resting on his thigh, fingers tapping a slow rhythm, not nervous, but calculating. Outside, the wind had shifted, carrying the rattle of the fence rails. Rose knew she couldn't outrun everything forever. But with Elias there, a man whose story she only half knew, she felt less exposed than she had in years. The rest of the morning, Elias barely left his place by the window. He didn't say much, but whenever Rose stepped outside, his eyes followed, not in control but in the way of someone who had lived too long in places where carelessness was fatal. By noon, when Rose brought a plate of bread and cold meat, Elias ate only half before pushing back his chair. He stepped out onto the porch, leaned against the post, and stared toward the distance. Rose followed his gaze. This time there was nothing but an empty field. "You ever think about selling this place?" Elias asked. Not as advice, just a question. Rose wiped her hands on her apron. "If I sold, what would I have left? A name on a piece of paper? A rented room somewhere full of people I don't know?" Elias gave a slow nod, as if her answer lined up with his own thoughts. He didn't press, only went back inside for the coat she'd washed days ago. The soap scent still clung faintly, but beneath the fabric was the trace of another life, one where he'd been part of the law, or at least believed in it. The afternoon passed in long, quiet hours. Rose tended the hens. Elias hauled down bales of hay. Neither spoke of the morning, but the space between them had shifted. It was no longer the wary gap between strangers. It felt more like an unsigned agreement. If trouble came, they would face it from the same side. That night, the north wind hissed through the cracks in the door, as if trying to slip into every dark corner of the wooden house. Rose woke abruptly to a strange burnt scent. Not the lingering smoke from the kitchen stove after supper, but something harsher, sharper, like green wood suddenly set alight. She swung her legs out of bed, bare feet finding the cold floorboards, pulled on a thin coat, and stepped quickly out to the porch. The ranch lay still under the silver-gray slide of moonlight over the barn roof. There were no flames in sight, yet the smoke smell was stronger, clinging thick in the back of her throat. She hurried toward the barn, her pulse pounding, fearing some of Elias's prized horses might have panicked and broken loose. But everything was in place. The horses only snorted softly, tails swishing, untroubled. She stood a moment, breath puffing white, trying to track the wind. The smoke wasn't coming from nearby. It drifted in from the southeast, from the dirt road that led toward the town of Redwater. The front door swung open. Elias stepped out into the dim spill of lamplight, shirt half-buttoned, a revolver in his hand. His gaze swept the yard and settled on Rose. "See anything?" His voice was low, clipped. Rose shook her head. "Not here. Smoke's from a distance." They stood for a moment, listening to the wind under the eaves and the chime of a loose chain. Then Elias gave a short nod, slid the gun back into its holster, and told her to go inside. Before he turned away, Rose caught the faint crease of a frown between his brows. By sunrise, word had already spread. The only general store in Redwater had burned to the ground overnight. Folks said the blaze came sudden, fast as if fed by oil. The storekeeper and his wife escaped, but all the goods were lost. The roof nothing but ash. Rose sat at the kitchen table, hands tight around her mug, while Elias relayed what a rider passing through had told him. "Not Luther's men," Elias said with certainty. Rose looked up. "You sure?" They haven't stopped leaning on us. Sure. He set his coffee down, eyes fixed on the window where morning mist still clung to the fence line. Luther likes to push face to face. Burning a store in town would only bring him heat. This was someone else. Someone who doesn't mind making noise. The words seemed to shrink the kitchen, as if the air had been pulled out. A chill ran down Rose's spine. Luther was dangerous enough, but this other force Elias spoke of was a blank space, harder to predict. In the days that followed, no riders appeared at the field's edge like before. But Rose began noticing small signs, a hawk shot, and left by the fence, unfamiliar hoof prints on the southern trail, the thud of hooves in the night that faded to silence. Elias said little, but she knew he was calculating. He spent more time in the barn, checking tack and ammunition. Sometimes she'd find him standing still, looking toward town, shoulders drawn tight as a bowstring. One afternoon, when she brought a kettle out to the porch, Elias was there sharpening a long-bladed knife. He glanced up at the sound of the door. "The ones who burned that store, if they come here, they won't come alone," he said, as if continuing a thought from earlier. Rose didn't answer. She poured tea, set the cup beside him, and sat down with her arms around her knees. The wind carried a faint trace of smoke, weaker now, but the memory of that night stayed vivid. "You think they're after something?" she asked quietly. Elias paused, looking at her for a long moment. "Could be. Or someone." The answer made her shiver. He didn't have to say who he meant. The old badge she'd found, the history he hadn't fully told, all of it was starting to knot together in a dangerous way. 3 days after the fire, Redwater was a tangle of rumors. People split into sides. Some swore it was an accident. Others claimed to have seen strange riders before the flames. Luther Kane stayed silent, which only fed talk of this other force moving in. Rose returned from town with flour and sugar, but her mind was crowded with the scraps of talk she'd heard on the way. Each one layered on more unease. When she reached the ranch, Elias was at the fence, staring into the distance. "What else do you think they'll try?" she asked as she walked up. He didn't turn, just said, "What I want to know is, why now?" She understood. If the aim was to threaten or take land, why not strike when Luther's men had first come? Why wait, then draw attention with a fire that would set the whole region talking? They stood in silence, listening to the wind rattle wire and the lowing of cattle far off. The evening sky was deepening, promising another long night. One Rose knew would be full of half-waking at every sound, every wisp of smoke in the air. That night, Elias took his guitar from the corner. He didn't play much, just a few low, steady chords that filled the small house, easing some of the tightness. Rose sat at the table, stitching the seam of his coat. "Tomorrow I'm riding into Redwater," he said, eyes still on the strings. "See what the fire left behind." Rose wanted to argue, but swallowed it. She knew he'd already made up his mind. And if anyone could read the signs left by whoever had lit that fire, it was Elias. The man who'd once worn the old badge, now sitting in the unlocked drawer she never touched. "Be back before dark," was all she said. Elias gave a small nod. The guitar's tone held steady, deep and measured, like a heartbeat keeping them anchored against the cold wind and the smoke that still hadn't fully left the night air. That afternoon, the sky looked like a stretched hide, pale gold, and drawn so tight it seemed a hard wind might tear it into strips. The road to the ranch was so still that the whisper of wind through the sagebrush carried clear as spoken words. Rose was shaking out blankets on the porch when she saw a dust plume in the distance, slow moving but steady, pushing into the western sky. As it neared, the plume became a gray horse, hooves steady, deliberate. In the saddle sat a woman, compact frame, straight-backed, her wide-brimmed hat pulled low. Strands of dark brown hair had slipped free of the bun, whipping sideways whenever the wind cut across. She didn't smile, didn't signal as she reached the gate. Rose laid the blanket over the porch rail and stepped down a few stairs. Women in the West rarely traveled alone, especially to a stranger's ranch. But this one showed no sign of hesitation. If anything, her eyes measured everything: the fence line, the apple tree beyond the barn, the water trough in the yard. She drew the reins, and her horse stopped. Her voice, low and roughened like someone long on the trail, carried across the yard. "I'm looking for Elias Carter." Rose glanced toward the house. Through the open doorway, Elias stood there, his shape cutting across the kitchen light. He stepped out, unhurried, his face showing no surprise. When his eyes met the woman's, there was a pull in the air, like an old rope drawn taut again. "Martha," Elias said quietly, like naming a truth that couldn't be dodged. Rose knew at once that name didn't belong to a stranger. The woman pressed her lips together, then turned her gaze to Rose. "I'm his sister." No handshake, no smile. Martha stayed mounted, eyes fixed on Rose as if trying to see past cloth and skin into something deeper. "I reckon he hasn't told you everything," Martha said, crisp and precise as if reading from a charge sheet. "Elias isn't just running from debt, he's running from the law." Rose felt her heartbeat land heavy in her chest. The word law fell into the yard like a stone into a dry well. No echo, only weight. Elias didn't blink. He stood straight, one hand resting loose at his belt. No denial, no explanation. Only silence. And that silence was enough for Rose to feel a new space open between them, cold and heavy as morning frost on grass before the sun rises. Martha tipped her chin toward the road. "If you've got any sense, you'll leave before it all comes down on you." Rose didn't answer. She noticed the thin haze of dust from the horse's hooves still hanging in the air, the smell of dirt and sweat, sharp and warm. Martha's eyes, in the shadow of her hat, were as sharp as a freshly honed blade. Elias stepped forward, closing the space between him and his sister to just a few paces. Rose thought he might speak, an explanation, or at least a demand that Martha go. Instead, he asked, "Who told you to? Come here?" Martha shrugged, a fleeting smile touching her lips, but never reaching her eyes. "I found it myself. Word travels fast in town." Rose realized her grip on the porch rail had tightened so hard her knuckles were pale. There was something in the way Elias and Martha faced each other. Not hatred, not warmth, but the kind of long-standing contest that had paused once, only to resume now. Martha didn't dismount. Her voice cut like a blade sliding through a narrow crack. "Don't let him pull you into this. You've still got a way out." Then she drew the reins, turned her horse, and rode off, dust rising in her wake. She left as she'd come, neither hurried nor slow, leaving the yard in a silence broken only by wind curling through the fence rails. Rose stayed on the porch steps, watching until Martha's figure shrank to a dot and vanished behind the ridge. Elias remained a few paces away. He didn't look at Rose right away, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the road disappeared. When he did turn, there was no apology, no plea, only something unreadable, like the surface of a lake on a windless day, too still to guess how deep it ran. My sister isn't like other people, Elias said, his voice low. Rose felt the words were both a warning and another curtain drawn across whatever she wasn't yet meant to see. All that afternoon, they didn't speak of Martha again. Elias went to the barn, busying himself with tack and saddles, while Rose stayed in the kitchen, her hands moving through chores while her mind wandered. Through the window, she saw him stroking the mane of the old horse, his motions slow and steady, like a man working to untangle something in his head. In Rose's mind, Martha's words repeated, each one carved into wood, running from the law. She didn't know the charge, didn't know the debt, but she knew that from now on, the space between her and Elias was no longer just a few steps of packed dirt. It was a fog thick enough to freeze if left too long. That night, as Rose lay in bed, the wind still hissed through the doorframe. The sounds of insects and branches brushing the eaves blended together. But somewhere out there, she thought she heard the faint beat of hooves, or maybe it was only her imagination. She turned toward the other side of the bed. Elias was asleep, his breathing even, his face calm, as if the afternoon had never happened. But Rose knew, calm was sometimes the hardest shell, hiding the kind of truths that could change the course of a life. Elias sat still for a long while, as if weighing whether each breath was worth the words he'd kept hidden for so many years. The wind outside slid under the porch boards, carrying the scent of dry grass and wood smoke, making the oil lamp's flames sway. Rose didn't look away from him, her fingers tracing the rim of a cold coffee cup, as if to keep herself from pressing too hard with impatient questions. At last, Elias spoke, his voice low and rough, not the way a man usually talks about himself, but the way someone confesses to a crime before the one person they can't bear to lose. He said that he had once been a deputy sheriff in Redwater, a town not far from here. When Luther came bringing gold, liquor, and promises to grow the region, most people took the bargain. Judges, lawmen, even men Elias had once called friends. At first he stood against it. Then came a case, a night of blood he would never forget. Elias had kept the evidence, papers, maps, and the written statement of a witness. He knew that if he turned it over to the authorities, it would vanish by morning. He also knew that if Luther found out he had it, Elias wouldn't live to see the next sunrise. So he did something that seemed simple, but was a gamble. He hid it all inside the hollow body of the guitar he always carried. An old guitar, its wood worn and scratched, the varnish dulled by years, but no one would guess it held something that could make an entire town shake. Rose listened in silence, her heartbeat quickening, not because the story was dramatic, but because of the way Elias spoke of it. There was no pride, no plea for understanding, only the weariness of a man who had chosen exile over watching justice rot before his eyes. Martha stood near the hearth, her shadow stretched long across the wall. When Elias finished, she stepped forward and touched the guitar in its stand, lightly, almost casually. The movement was too natural, too familiar, and Rose felt a cold ripple down her spine. Martha didn't look at Elias when she spoke, only asked quietly, "You've kept it all this time?" Elias nodded. No more words. No explanation. Rose met Martha's gaze. It wasn't the look of a sister come to protect her brother. There was calculation there, a flicker of urgency carefully hidden, and something that looked like regret, as if she had traveled a long road not to see Elias, but to get close to the guitar. The silence in the room thickened. The lamp guttered, shadows of man and women overlapping on the wall. But between Elias and Martha, Rose could feel an invisible line, not a wall of hatred, but a taut wire strung with unspoken truths. Elias crossed to the guitar stand, lifted the instrument, and held it close, like a man guarding the last thing that was his. His fingers brushed the strings, pulling a low, muted note, then he set it back down. "It stays here because it's not time yet," Elias said, his eyes fixed on it. Martha pressed her lips together. She sat, but her gaze never left the instrument. Rose noticed that since Martha had arrived, Elias spoke less and looked away more, as if guarding himself from a wind strong enough to strip everything bare. Rose wondered, if the guitar truly held the key to bringing Luther down, was Martha here to help Elias use it, or to take it for herself? And if it was the latter, what would Elias do? Outside, the night was dense, the north wind threading through the boards, carrying the faint smoke of that recent fire, a reminder that more than one force was moving toward them. In that moment, Rose understood. The guitar didn't just hold evidence. It tethered Elias to the past he'd been running from. And now, with Martha here, that tether could be pulled tight enough to snap. Elias sat at the table, one heavy hand resting on the worn wood. Martha, every so often, cast a glance at the guitar, like a hawk watching for its prey to look away. Rose stayed quiet. But in her mind, a plan was already forming. If Elias couldn't keep it safe, she would. Not because she fully believed in what it contained, but because she knew. If he lost it, Elias would lose the last bit of courage that kept him standing upright in this life. In the wind, Rose thought she heard the faint ring of guitar strings. Whether from the draft or from a hand, she couldn't tell. But it was enough to remind her that from now on, every step, every glance in this house would have to be measured. And anyone who came near that guitar, whether Martha or Elias himself, could be the start of something bigger than any fire in Redwater. That night, Rose didn't sleep. She sat with her back to the wall, listening to the wind at the eaves, glancing now and then toward the corner where the guitar stood, silent, but heavy as a witness who knew the whole truth. She knew that from here on, the story between the three of them would no longer be about shared meals or porch talks. It would be a game of moves, each one leaving a mark that couldn't be erased. 2 days later, the morning in Dust Hollow began with an unusual kind of silence. No hoofbeats on the dirt road, no barking from a neighbor's dog, only the faint drift of wind through the fence rails, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant wood smoke. Rose stepped onto the porch as she always did, coffee pot in hand, and saw something lying just inside the gate. A crumpled envelope, its edges damp from the night's dew and grit from the road. There were no tracks, no prints, no sound of retreating steps or hooves. She bent to pick it up, feeling the chill and faint damp in the paper, as if it had been there all night, waiting for the day's first light before being found. The wax seal was half broken, stamped with the image of a coiled snake around a revolver, the mark everyone in town knew belonged to Luther Kane. Rose stood for a moment, hearing only her own heartbeat, steady but slow. She tore open the envelope and unfolded the paper inside, creased into thirds. The handwriting was hurried, jagged, but clear enough to leave no doubt. "Turn over Boone and what he carries, and I'll spare your land." No greeting, no signature. Just a bare-edged command that didn't bother to hide its intent. She read it once, then again, slower, to be sure there wasn't some hidden line she'd missed. But the page stayed empty but for those words, words like a cold knife laid in the middle of the kitchen table, needing no further threat. Rose didn't give herself time to dwell on it. Her fingers pressed into the paper until it crumpled. Without hesitation, she went inside, opened the stove door. The coal bed glowed as she dropped the note in. Flame curled the edges, swallowing the words in a few breaths, leaving only blackening curls of ash. When Elias stepped into the room, the scent of burned paper still hung in the air. His eyes went from the ashes to her, darkening. "What was that?" His voice was low, not hurried. Rose didn't turn from the stove. "A message from Luther Kane." He stepped closer, stopping beside the kitchen table. "What does he want?" "You," she said simply, meeting his gaze. "And what you're carrying." Elias's expression didn't harden, didn't shift in surprise. He only tilted his head slightly, as if her answer was something he'd already expected. He stayed silent for a long beat, eyes on the last embered scraps. "Rose," he said finally, voice rougher than usual. "If I go, you'll be safe. He'll have no reason to come after this land." It didn't sound like an offer. It sounded like a conclusion he'd arrived at long before. But to Rose it was an empty space between what he wanted to believe and what would actually happen. She leaned lightly against the table, arms folded. "I wouldn't count on it. Luther's not the kind to keep his word. Today, it's you. Tomorrow it could be anyone in this town. If you leave, all you tell him is that anyone can be driven out." Elias shut his eyes for a moment, then opened them, holding her in his gaze. There was something there besides defiance, something close to worry, locked behind a steady mask. "You don't know what you're standing against," he said, slow, deliberate. "Maybe not," Rose replied evenly, "but I know who I'm standing with." The space between them tightened, not by a step, but by the kind of silence that grows heavy. Elias didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, as if deciding whether to speak or keep the thought buried. Outside, the wind shifted, catching the porch boards and making the door creak. The sound didn't break the moment. It deepened it. Rose turned back to the stove, nudging the ashes aside with the poker. "We stay," she said, not as a suggestion, but as a decision she'd already made for herself. Elias's mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but no longer drawn tight. He nodded once and then crossed to the window, looking out. "Stay," he echoed, as if trying the word in his mouth. She didn't need another promise. His agreement, short as it was enough. A little later, Elias left the window and moved to the corner where his guitar leaned against the wall. He laid a hand on the neck, not lifting it, just touching it out of habit. Rose knew what was inside, knew it was what Luther wanted. She also knew that the moment that letter burned, they'd turned away from the easiest road. That night, the sky held no moon, only a scatter of stars like old light against black. Rose sat on the porch steps, scarf wrapped tight at her neck, listening to the wood creak as Elias came out, his dark coat swallowing most of his outline. He sat beside her, saying nothing, eyes fixed on the dark where the dirt road disappeared into shadow. In the quiet, they heard the wind, the crackle of the fire inside, and somewhere far off, the solitary bark of a dog. "You know," Elias said after a while, voice so low the wind nearly carried it off, "when I was deputy, I thought I could fix something, but I learned some things can't be fixed by the law." Rose didn't turn her head, her eyes still on the horizon. "But they can be held by people." He breathed out. Not quite a laugh, but not as heavy as before. Maybe so. The look they shared then was unhurried, careful, like a rope being tied slowly so it wouldn't snap in the wind. No one said the word promise, but it was there, quiet between them. Inside, the fire still burned, the letter's ashes gone cold. But the choice had been made the moment the flames took it. A choice that would make the road ahead harder, but also clearer than it had ever been. They would stay. And staying meant being ready to face what came. Dawn came slow to Redwater, as if the town itself was reluctant to step into another day. The first light didn't pour in all at once. It crept, brushing the edges of tin roofs and the frost-gray boards of the fences. Rose was bent over, pouring coffee, when hoofbeats sounded from far off. Steady, deliberate, the kind that spoke of purpose, not a neighbor's early ride. Elias stepped out onto the porch, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe, his eyes narrowing the way a man's will when he's used to sizing things up from a long distance. A chestnut horse stopped at the gate, dust from the road settling in pale layers over the rider's boots. It wasn't Luther Kane, nor one of the usual faces that rode for him. This man was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a sheriff's coat so new it hadn't yet been worn down by the wind, but his face carried lines the badge couldn't smooth over. Rose watched from the doorway, unsettled. The man pulled off his gloves, climbing the steps at an easy pace. "Hank Doyle," Elias said, his rough voice holding both surprise and caution. Doyle smiled faintly, the smile of a man who owed a life. Years ago, back when Elias was a deputy in another town, he'd dragged Doyle out of an ambush in the Western Pass. It was a thing neither of them ever spoke of, but both had carried since. "Heard you were here," Doyle said, his voice low but without threat. "Figured it was better I come myself." His gaze swept the yard, then settled on Rose, half inside, half out, holding her coffee like she was bracing for bad news. Elias leaned a shoulder against the porch post. "If you're here to arrest me, say it plain." Doyle shook his head. "No, but you should know. Luther's not the only one looking for you. There are others, further out, quieter, and they're patient." It didn't sound like an ordinary warning. It carried the weight of old business, things Elias had tried to bury when he walked away from the badge. Rose felt a cold trace work down her spine. Elias stayed silent a few moments, his eyes flicking to Rose for just an instant, a silent steadying. Then he asked, "Whose side are you on, Doyle?" "The side I still owe," Doyle said simply, needing no more words. He adjusted the brim of his hat, turned toward the steps, but before mounting up, he stepped close enough to speak low, only to Elias. "If you're still holding what I think you're holding, don't let it sit in one place too long." Elias didn't answer. The only sign was the tightening of his jaw. Doyle gave the smallest nod, then swung back into the saddle, riding off and leaving a trail of pale dust caught in the first stretch of sunlight. Rose didn't move until the hoofbeats faded past the birch grove. Then she turned to Elias. "Do you trust him?" Elias slowly removed his hat, showing the gray in his hair, dusted with the road. "Enough, but I trust a debt longer." Inside, Rose set her cup on the table, though her hand hadn't stopped trembling. Doyle's warning wasn't just about Luther. She knew that from the way Elias had gone quiet after every sentence. Morning light began to thread through the kitchen window, falling across the guitar in the corner. Rose glanced at it, remembering the strange touch Martha had given it that day, and the unease it left. Something was tying them all together, Elias, Martha, Luther, and now Doyle, in a loop she couldn't yet see the shape of. Elias sat down, one arm resting on the table, eyes focused somewhere past the wall. "You know," he said, "Doyle's not the kind of man who comes unless he has to. Which means, what I've got is starting to keep folks awake at night." Rose asked, "So what do we do?" Elias turned his eyes to hers. There was no rush in them, but there was weight. "We stay. But from now on, you're not outside of this anymore." The words brought her a strange mix of fear and steadiness. Fear, because whatever Elias held was dangerous enough for many to want it. Steadiness, because at least now he wasn't planning to carry it alone. That day, Redwater went on like any other. The ring of hammers from the blacksmiths, the jingle of the store's front door, children chasing one another around the town well. But to Rose, each sound felt layered. She watched longer when strangers lingered near the house, noticed the glances from certain men at the saloon when Elias passed by. By late afternoon, Elias was in the barn. Rose followed, saying nothing, leaning against the doorway as he checked the saddles. The setting sun stretched their shadows long across the ground until they touched, one into the other. "Who do you think Doyle meant? The others?" Rose asked. Elias pulled the leather straps tight before answering. "Could be someone Luther's bought, or someone Luther's afraid of. Out here, there's always a man behind the man at the top." Rose pressed her lips together, asking nothing more. Sometimes silence mattered more than any promise. That night, under the soft yellow of the oil lamp, Elias took the guitar down, not to play, but to open the hidden latch in its back. His hands moved quick, practiced, as if he'd done it 100 times in the dark. Rose didn't look inside, but the metallic sound told her it wasn't just paper in there. He closed it again, set it back in its place. "When the time comes, this goes to someone who's earned it. Until then, it doesn't leave my sight." Rose nodded, then stood to pour more coffee, as if that small act could stretch the evening's peace a little longer. Outside, the night wind began to rise, carrying the scent of damp pine and faintly, something like smoke, far off, but distinct. Redwater slept, but somewhere out there, footsteps were already moving closer. Elias knew it. Rose knew it. And between them, there was one thing neither had to say out loud. Neither of them would let the other stand alone. No one in town could say why Luther Kane suddenly pulled back. No gunfire, no shadowy figures drifting near the fence. Just one fog-heavy morning when his hired hands vanished as if they'd never been there. The tension that had gripped Redwater for weeks dissolved, but it left behind a strange quiet, like a predator that had only paused the hunt, not left the woods. Rose stood by the window, embroidery frame in her hands, but her eyes were fixed on the empty stretch of ground out front. Since Luther's disappearance, even the wind seemed to blow differently, lighter, but with a chill underneath she couldn't name. Elias said nothing. He didn't believe in peace that came too easily. Instead of watching the horizon, he kept his hands busy. They set to rebuilding the fence, lifting each plank and securing it with fresh nails. When Elias hefted the boards, the muscles in his arms shifted under the worn cotton of his shirt. Rose held the wood steady, passed him nails. Sometimes their hands brushed. At first they traded polite, passing smiles, but soon their eyes lingered. Their words lost some of the guarded edge. They repaired the barn together. replacing rotted slats with fresh timber, shoring up the roof so rain wouldn't find its way in. While they worked, Elias showed Rose how to cinch a saddle, how to comb a horse's mane without making it shy. She fumbled at first, tangling the strap, but he didn't scold, just took her hands in his and walked her through each knot. In that moment, Rose noticed how his grip was both steady and gentle, rare in a man who'd weathered as much as he had. At night, they ate by the glow of the oil lamp. Sometimes Elias told pieces of old stories. Sometimes Rose read aloud from the book she was translating. Elias wasn't much for letters, but he listened close, now and then asking the meaning of a word or the turn of a phrase. Rose found herself liking that. Two very different worlds finding a language they could share. Little by little, the distance between them blurred. Gone was the wary caution of strangers forced under the same roof. In its place was a quiet warmth, the kind that made a person think about staying. Rose knew it wouldn't last. Luther Kane was still out there, and Sheriff Hank Doyle's warning still echoed in her mind. But maybe that was what made each moment of calm worth more. One evening the wind rose harder than usual, carrying the scent of far-off rain. Rose shut the window. Elias checked the barn. When he came back in, she was at the table, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. The lamplight washed over her face, bringing a soft glow to the steady, watchful eyes. He sat down across from her without a word. They drank and listened to the wind lash the walls. In that moment, Rose thought, if peace had a shape, it might look like this. Two people who'd known loss finding each other in a land that promised nothing, yet choosing to stay. A temporary peace. Rose knew it never lasted. But when Elias played slow, measured notes on the porch, the wind weaving through the sound of wood and string, she also knew this. Some moments, no matter how fragile, were strong enough to anchor a soul to life. That evening, Redwater lay in an uncommon hush. No urgent hoofbeats down the main road. No dry wind whistling through the door gaps like the nights before. Only the faint scent of hay drifting from the barn, and the glow of the hearth casting warm circles of light out onto the porch. Elias sat on the wooden step, guitar across his lap, fingers picking a nameless tune. The notes weren't polished, hesitant in places, but each one carried weight, as if the steel strings were giving voice to a soul long accustomed to drifting. Rose sat a few paces away in the old wicker chair, her cream cotton dress falling neatly to her ankles. In her hands was one of his shirts, the sleeve frayed at the cuff. She was mending the seam, each stitch even and deliberate. The last of the day's light rested on her shoulder, wrapping them both in a thin honey-gold haze. Elias stopped playing and set the guitar aside. Leaning back against the porch post, he looked out toward the pasture where the cattle were moving slow toward the trough. Then he spoke, voice low and unhurried. I never thought I'd be anywhere I'd call home. Rose lifted her head. Her eyes caught his, steady, unblinking. Home, she said, her tone certain but gentle, isn't where you arrive. It's where you stay, and where you're loved at your true size. He tilted his head slightly, as if her words had brushed against a part of his memory he wasn't ready to lay bare. Elias had slept in too many bunkhouses, beside too many campfires, to think about putting down roots. He'd learned to leave before he was made to leave. Rose set the mended shirt in her lap, fingers interlacing loosely. A light wind drifted in from the pasture, carrying pine and warm ash from the hearth, threading through the quiet space between them. Elias leaned forward, his broad, weathered hand brushing hers. Not hard, not hurried, like a man testing the first stone of a bridge he meant to cross. No explanations, no promises. Only the wind and the silence they shared. A small trust, fragile but real, began to take root. After that moment, neither spoke again about staying. But in the days that followed, every small act seemed to answer a question neither of them had asked aloud. Elias rebuilt the chicken coop, adding a door to keep foxes out at night. Rose said nothing, but every morning she brought him a cup of hot coffee before he stepped outside. They began to share the small tasks they once did alone. Elias carried the heavy flour sacks from the shed to the kitchen. Rose checked the saddle straps before he rode out. The autumn afternoons grew shorter, the air sharper, but their time on the porch grew longer. Sometimes Elias played guitar, and sometimes Rose sang a folk song from her childhood, her voice low and clear. Other nights they said nothing at all, listening to the insects, and far off, the Redwater River's slow wash against the bank. Elias realized he'd stopped counting the days until he'd leave. Rose realized she'd stopped expecting him to. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Elias lay awake. Rose's words returned to him. Home isn't where you arrive. It's where you stay, and where you're loved at your true size. The line kept sounding in his mind like a string still vibrating after the hand had lifted. He thought about all the places he'd left before anyone could claim him as belonging there. He'd believed roaming was the only way to survive. But now, he wasn't so sure. And somewhere deep inside, he wondered if he'd already found that place. In the other room, Rose lay awake too. She thought about the look in Elias's eyes when he'd said he'd never thought he'd have a place called home. It wasn't just weariness she'd seen there. It was something like hope, thin but present. She knew trust didn't bloom in a night, but she also knew that if she could, she wanted to stay long enough to see it grow. Outside, the wind crossed the pasture again, carrying the scent of hay and damp earth. Inside the small house in Redwater, two people, once strangers, once locked tight against the world, were opening inch by inch. Not through vows, but through quiet, steady acts. Not from fear of losing, but from the want to keep. And that was when a place had begun to be called home. Some stories don't need to close. They only need to keep living in the mind of the listener. Just like the way Elias and Rose found a place to stay, sometimes late, but in time enough for the rest of a life.